the morning she overheard him. The well rope was frozen. Nora Aldridge had come down before 5, as she always did in October, to draw the first water before the household woke, and claimed the yard for themselves. The estate well sat at the far end of the kitchen garden, screened on the north side by a low stone wall. She had pressed her back against more times than she could count, resting her shoulders between hauls. She had set the pail down and was working the ice loose from the rope with both thumbs, when she heard the two voices come around the corner of the stable block. She did not move. She was not hiding. There was simply no moment to do anything else before the voices were close enough to carry. The Duke of Stratheld spoke first. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not vary much, regardless of what it was saying. His secretary, a thin man named Pharaoh, answered him in quick half-sentences. Nora understood perhaps 2/3 of what they said. She understood the word enclosure. She understood the phrase common ground. She understood the figure of £6,000, spoken by Pharaoh and received by the Duke without visible reaction. She understood because she was the daughter of a village schoolmaster who had taught her to read civic machinery with the same attention he gave grammar, that the vote the Duke was describing would remove 200 families from land they had worked for 2 generations. She also understood, when the voices moved away, that she had been kneeling beside the estate well with her cheek against cold stone, and that no one had seen her. She finished drawing the water. She carried it inside. She set it on the copper and stood for a moment with her hands at her sides in the dark of the scullery, and she did not yet know what she was going to do. She was not a woman anyone in this county looked at twice. Nora had been a laundress at Kessington Hall for 14 months since her father's death, had taken the schoolhouse and the small wage with it. She was 23 years old and possessed of a face the season would never have noticed, not because it lacked structure, but because she kept it carefully. Unremarkable the way a woman in service learns to wear her intelligence like a second apron, tucked away and practical and not offered to anyone who hadn't asked. Her hands were red to the wrist from the work. Her gowns were plain enough that she blended with the linen she carried. She walked the corridors of Kessington Hall as though she were furniture, and the household had been kind enough to agree with her. Her father, Samuel Aldridge, had been dead 11 months. He had died, leaving her a clear conscience, a small wooden trunk of books, and no money at all. She did not permit herself to grieve in the laundry. She permitted herself to be efficient, thorough, and invisible, because those 3 qualities kept the position, and the position kept her fed. The schoolmaster had believed, with a precision that bordered on theological conviction, that civic life required truthful witnesses. He had written so in his journal, the one she carried in her apron pocket, because the pages were small, and the paper was thin, and it fit without bulk. She had read that particular entry so many times that she could reconstruct it by touch from the pressure of the pen. The man who sees and does not speak has chosen the lesser comfort. She had not, on that October morning beside the icy well rope, decided to become a witness. She had only decided not to lie. The solicitor came to the laundry 3 days later. He was not her solicitor. He was a man named Sims who worked for the Duke's estate agents, and who arrived at the servants' entrance asking for Miss Aldridge, with the particular courtesy of a man who expected compliance and had dressed the expectation in good manners. He sat across from her employer, Mrs. Chauce. Crane, and he explained that there had been some question of what the laundress had seen or heard near the well on the morning of the 14th, and that it would be helpful to confirm she had been elsewhere entirely. Mrs. Crane looked at Nora. Nora looked at Mr. Sims. She said that she had been at the well on the morning of the 14th, that she had drawn water as she always did before 5, and that she had been there for perhaps 10 minutes. She said this quietly, without embellishment. Mr. Sims thanked her for her candor. He left in the direction he had come. Mrs. Crane dismissed her the following morning. There was no particular cruelty in it. Mrs. Crane was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who managed 40 servants and an estate that required the goodwill of its owner. And a laundress who had put herself in the path of a solicitor's attention was a risk she could not afford to carry. She gave Nora 2 extra weeks of wages and a written character that said nothing objectionable. Nora accepted both, thanked her, and carried her trunk to the village. She stayed in the room above Reverend Aldgate's kitchen. He was a small, serious man who had known her father, and who asked her no questions she did not volunteer. He did, however, write a letter. She did not see the letter before he sent it. She would not learn what it contained for another 3 weeks. When it arrived at a committee of Parliament, it had been addressed to Mr. Capley. Geoffrey Colmar, Member of Parliament for the neighbouring constituency, who had been quietly collecting evidence that the proposed enclosure of Halstead Common was attended by certain private financial inducements to the men who would cast the deciding votes. Nora had not known about Mr. Colmar. She had not sent the letter, had not asked for it, had not known it was going. When Reverend Aldgate explained this to her at supper one evening, turning his teacup in his hands, she sat for some time without speaking. "I told him only what you told me," he said. "What you heard. What you chose to confirm to the solicitor." "I did not choose to confirm it to Parliament," she said. "No," he said. "But you chose not to lie. Parliament followed from that." She looked at her hands. He added, "Your father would have said that honesty does not consult its consequences before it speaks." She did not answer. She thought her father had perhaps never had a solicitor sit across from him in a laundry, with quite that particular smile. If you are staying with this story, I am glad of it. There are people who deserve to be seen clearly, and Nora Aldridge is one of them. The information reached Parliament, slowly at first, and then with gathering weight. The committee that received Reverend Aldgate's letter was a small body with limited authority, but it possessed the one quality that made small bodies with limited authority dangerous: persistence, steady, and unhurried. They requested documentation. The estate agent's records contained a payment notation that did not align with any declared contract. A second notation, in a different hand, referenced a vote scheduled for the 22nd of November. Nora knew none of this. She had returned to existence in the village, taking in mending, walking twice a week to a neighboring farm to help with correspondence, using her father's books in the evenings with the lamp burning low. She was managing. She was not comfortable, but she had never particularly expected comfort. She had expected honest work, and she had that. And the quiet that came with it settled around her like something almost bearable. It was at the farm, bringing a parcel of mended collars to the farmhouse door, that she first heard her name, spoken by a stranger. Lady Corinna Marchman had come to take tea with the farmer's wife, and had brought with her a companion, a fair-haired woman named Miss Felton, who was waiting in the yard with evident displeasure at the cold, and who, when Nora arrived at the gate, looked her over with the swift economy of a woman accustomed to assigning women their proper category. "She is only a washerwoman," Miss Felton said to her mistress, not particularly quietly as they passed inside. "The Stratheld business will come to nothing. These people always overestimate their consequence." Nora heard the words with the clean precision of cold air. Lady Corinna was beautiful in the way of certain English women in their late 20s, composed and polished and designed for exactly the kind of drawing-room alliance that her family and the Duke's political associates had been quietly constructing for the better part of a year. She was the correct choice. She had been told so her entire life, by everyone whose opinion had ever mattered, and she wore that certainty the way she wore her pearl earrings, lightly, as though it cost nothing, as though it had never occurred to her that it might be otherwise. She glanced at Nora once from the doorway without recognition and without malice, simply without interest. Nora delivered the collars, thanked the farmer's wife for her business, and walked back to the village in the gray afternoon light. The Duke's name had entered her days by then, not as a presence, but as a weather. She heard it in the market at the church door from the blacksmith's boy who repeated what his father said about enclosures and common ground and what always happened when the great landowners found a reason to be generous with other people's property. She heard it from Reverend Aldgate carefully, in the evenings, as the committee's inquiry began to take shape in the notices. She had a mental image of the Duke of Stratheld that was built from voice and reputation, and the sharp October air by the well and nothing more. She did not expect to meet him. She did not expect the linens. Kessington Hall sent a parcel of table linens to be laundered at the village, a routine arrangement that predated Nora's dismissal, and which she had been quietly hired to handle for want of anyone more convenient. The parcel arrived on a Tuesday, and she returned it on Thursday, neatly pressed, in a basket covered with brown paper. She had not intended to leave anything in the basket. Her father's journal had been in her apron pocket, as always. A single page had come loose at the stitching, the entry she had memorized, the one about truthful witnesses. She had tucked it back, and apparently tucked it with slightly less care than usual, because when she lifted the basket that morning to take it to the hall, it was there, folded, pressed between two tablecloths like a letter someone had meant to send. She discovered this only after the basket had been collected. She did not pursue it. There was no dignified way to explain a loose journal page in a table linen parcel to the servants of a duke currently under parliamentary inquiry, and dignity was the one possession she had not surrendered. The duke came to the village 6 days later. He came on horseback, alone, without Faro or any man of business. Nora was at the pump in the square when she saw him dismount, and she recognized his voice before she finished turning. He was taller than the voice had suggested. He wore a dark coat, plain by the standard of his rank, and his face was not quite what she would have imagined. There was something tired in it, and something working as though he were solving a problem by touch in a very dark room. He had the journal page in his coat pocket. He took it out and held it toward her with both hands, the way one returns something that belongs to another person and knows it. "Miss Aldridge," he said. She had not expected him to know her name. She felt the surprise register somewhere behind her sternum and did not let it reach her face. "Your Grace," she said. He said, "I believe this is yours." She took the page. She folded it without looking at it and put it in her pocket. He said, "I read it. I should not have." "But I did." "The handwriting is not yours." "No," she said. "It is my father's. The schoolmaster." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of late autumn sky, just before the color leaves it entirely. "You were at the well on the morning of the 14th, he said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "And you told Sim so." "Yes." "Why?" She considered this with the same attention she would have given a practical problem, because it was at its core a practical problem. She said, "Because he asked me a question I could only answer honestly. I was there. I heard what I heard. If I had told him otherwise, I would have known that I told him otherwise, and I did not want to live with that." He was quiet for long enough that a cart passed between them on the road, and they both waited for it. He said, "You did not go to the committee yourself. You did not write to anyone." "No," she said. "The Reverend wrote the letter. I did not know it was going." Something shifted in his face. Not softened, exactly. Something more like a recalibration. The way a man looks when a sum he has been working comes out to a number he did not expect. "Come inside," he said. He met the inn across the square, which had a parlor where they might speak, without the pump and the cold, and the particular quality of being looked at in a public square. The words were a command. She heard underneath them something more careful than command, and it was that quality, more than the words, that made her follow. In the inn parlor he sat across from her with a glass of something he did not drink and told her, with the plain articulation of a man who had spent a week confirming an answer he did not want, what his own inquiry had uncovered. The parlor was small and warm, a single fire, and 2 chairs and a table that had seen better decades. She had been in rooms like it before, the rooms to which women in her position were admitted when the business required a degree of privacy, but not a degree of respect. And she noted the room's quality without feeling it as an injury. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him, and waited the steward, Bernard Holt. A man his father had trusted implicitly, and who had continued to manage the estate with a competence so thorough that no one had looked underneath it for 7 years. The financial arrangement with the enclosure consortium had been made in the Duke's name by Holt, acting on his own initiative, drawing on an account the Duke believed was held in reserve for estate improvements. The vote was real. The Duke had intended to cast it in good conscience on the basis of agricultural surveys he had read carefully and trusted. The money had been placed without his knowledge. He had been used as a signature. She was aware, as he spoke, of the quality of his voice at close range. It was still even, still controlled. But underneath the control, there was something that had been worked very hard recently, and was tired from it. She recognized the particular exhaustion of a person who had looked at a thing they trusted and found it was not what they had believed. She had had that particular morning herself, 11 months ago, when the solicitor had come to tell her what her father's accounts actually contained. "My father died 3 years ago in debt," the Duke said. "Holt served him for 20 years. I believe the estate's recovery was Holt's good management. It turns out it was Holt's good management of arrangements I did not know existed." He set the glass down. "I had the ledgers opened last Tuesday. It took my solicitor 2 days to find the first notation. It took him 4 more hours to find the rest." She sat with this. She thought of her father's voice in the schoolroom, explaining to a room of children that the most common kind of dishonesty was the kind that wore the face of loyalty, because loyalty asked no questions. She said, "You did not know." She said, "You were going to cast that vote." "Yes," he said, "based on what I believed I knew." He looked at her with a directness that cost something. "Based on information that was incomplete, managed, and ultimately false. You heard what you heard, and you were right about what it meant, and I was wrong. I will not pretend otherwise." To you there was something in that sentence that she had not been prepared for. Not the admission, exactly, but the precision of it. The fact that he had addressed it directly to her, as though her understanding were the specific thing that required satisfying. She said, "What happens to the vote?" "It will not stand," he said. "The committee has already moved to refer the matter for full inquiry. The seat itself is suspended, pending the outcome. My advisors tell me this may take 6 months," she said, "and the families." He said, "The enclosure will not proceed. That is the one certainty I can offer at the moment." She looked at the table between them. Then she looked at him. "Thank you for returning my father's page," she said. He said very quietly, "Thank you for being at the well." She stood, and he stood, and they stood for a moment in the inn parlor with the fire going and the sound of the road outside, and she was aware of the distance between them as a particular kind of silence, the kind that is full of something neither person has yet put into words. Not yet, she thought. The following week she was summoned to the committee. Pie. She had not expected this either, and yet when the letter came, addressed to her in a formal hand, she found that the surprise was smaller than she might have anticipated. She had been honest at the beginning, and honesty had a momentum of its own. It seemed a tendency to require further honesty, until the first account was settled. The committee met in a low-ceilinged room in London around a long table of dark oak, at which sat 5 men of varying ages who looked at her with the careful neutrality of people who had been trained to assess testimony. She had never been to London. She had taken the post-chaise and sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the country give way to streets, and had thought about her father, and the particular inconvenience of having been raised to believe that civic duty was worth the inconvenience it asked. A parliamentary aide named Torrance brought her in from the anteroom. She heard him say it to his colleague as they passed the door. The same words she had heard in the farmyard from Miss Felton. "Only a washerwoman," he said, as though the category accounted for the quality of what she was about to say. She sat at the table. The room smelled of tallow and paper and the particular cold mustiness of buildings that housed authority and were not heated adequately for the people who had to sit in them rather than those who had to speak. The 5 men regarded her with the careful, slightly flattened attention of men who assessed testimony regularly and had learned to hold their faces in reserve. She was aware that she was the least-ranked person who had sat in this chair in some time, and she was aware that this fact would, in the minds of the men looking at her, affect the weight they assigned to what she said. She could not change that. She could only say what was true, with enough precision that the weight became undeniable. She answered their questions for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She described the morning of the 14th in specific, unembellished terms. The frozen rope, the cold air, the two voices, the exact words she had understood and the ones she had not. She kept her hands still in her lap. She did not embellish. She did not reach for effect. She spoke the way her father had taught her to speak about things that mattered, plainly, without ornament, with the understanding that plain truth was harder to dismiss than decorated truth because there was less to pick at. She described Mr. Sims's visit to the laundry, and what she had said to him and what she had declined to say. She described the dismissal from Kensington Hall that followed. One of the committee members, an older man with white hair and a face that looked as though it had witnessed several decades of testimony, asked her if she had acted out of political interest. She said no. He asked her if anyone had paid her or promised her anything. She said no. He asked why. In that case, she had confirmed the truth to Sims, when a denial would have cost her nothing, and honesty had cost her her position. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father believed that the man who sees and does not speak has chosen the lesser comfort. I was raised to find that a more expensive choice than speaking, even when speaking was not cheap." The older committee member made a note. The aide, named Torrance behind her, said nothing at all. The session continued for another 2 weeks without her. She returned to the village and resumed the mending and the lamp in the evenings and the careful economy of a life that had contracted to what was necessary and no more. She did not hear from the Duke. She had not expected to. She had told him the truth, and he had thanked her, and they were, by every social measure the season recognized, so far apart in station that further contact required some sufficient occasion to justify it. The dark moment arrived, without warning, on a Thursday afternoon in Reverend Aldgate's parlor. The Duke came again. He did not come alone this time. He had Pharaoh with him, and the energy of a man who had spent several days arriving at an incorrect conclusion and had not yet realized it was incorrect. He stood in the small parlor with his hat in his hand and his jaw set in a line that Nora recognized, with a cold weight in her stomach, as controlled fury. "I have been informed," he said, "that before the committee session there was contact between yourself and Mr. Colmar. Not through the Reverend. Directly. A letter, allegedly, in which you offered him specific details in exchange for a formal position in his household." She looked at him. She said, "No, no. There was no letter, or no. You deny receiving anything." "There was no letter," she said. "I have not written to Mr. Colmar. I have not met Mr. Colmar. I do not know where he lives." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who wants to believe what he is hearing and has been recently educated in the cost of believing things he could not verify. "Holt told my solicitor," he said. He produced a document. She said, "Then the document is a lie. Holt arranged a payment in your name without your knowledge. He is capable of producing a document that does not correspond to reality." She said this without heat, which was, she would later think, perhaps the most difficult thing she had ever done. He stood in the parlor with the document still in the world somewhere, with Holt's claim still in the air between them, and she watched him work through it. She watched his face go through something she could not fully name. Not doubt of her exactly, but the particular anguish of a man who has been wrong before, in a way that mattered, and who is trying to determine whether he is being wrong again. She said, "Your Grace, I did not go to Parliament. I did not write letters. I did not ask to be summoned, or to testify. What I did was answer a question honestly in a laundry. And I would do it again, and I know you are looking at me and trying to decide if I am telling you the truth, so I will tell you what I told the committee. I am my father's daughter, and I was raised by a man who believed that the most dangerous choice a person could make was to see clearly and report otherwise. That is all I can give you. I cannot give you certainty. I can give you what I know." The silence in the parlor lasted a very long time. She watched him make a decision. She could see it happening the way one sees weather shift over open ground, a slow movement from one condition to another. Not sudden, but certain. He said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing," she said. "You owe it to your own judgment." He left. She sat for some time after that with her hands in her lap, and the fire going and the small parlor very quiet. And she thought about her father, and about cost, and about the fact that honesty did not promise a reward, had never promised a reward, had only ever promised that one would know, in the end, what one had chosen. The parliamentary session on the 15th of December was not a large gathering by the standards of political London, but it was witnessed by enough people that what was said inside it traveled by evening post to 3 county newspapers, and by the following morning to every dinner table in the radius of the constituency. He had requested time to address the committee in session. He was granted 40 minutes. He used 17 of them. He described with a specific and unsparing clarity that Nora had heard once before in an inn parlor the financial arrangements that had been made in his name without his knowledge. He named Holt. He produced the ledger evidence his solicitor had uncovered. He named the consortium. He withdrew his vote from the enclosure record entirely. Not on the grounds of procedural objection, but on the grounds that the vote had been corrupted at its source and could not stand as honest. He said that the families of Holstead Common would not be displaced. He said that the steward Bernard Holt had been dismissed from Kessington Hall and referred to the appropriate civil authority. And then he said, with the level voice of a man who had decided precisely what was true and was not going to manage it into something smaller, that the reason any of this had come to light at all was that a woman named Miss Aldridge had been at a well on the morning of the 14th of October, had heard what she heard, and had, when given the opportunity to be comfortable and silent, chosen instead to be honest. Miss Aldridge told Parliament what Parliament needed to hear, he said. She did so at cost to herself, and without benefit to herself, and I would ask this committee to have it on record that she acted with a degree of civic courage that this House has not always required of persons in her station and does not always reward. He sat down. The aide named Torrance, standing behind his superior at the committee table, was very still. Lady Corinna Marchmont, who had come with her father to observe the session, sat for a long moment without moving. She left before the session concluded. She did not return. Nora read about it in the Reverend's parlor by the fire in the newspaper that arrived 4 days later. She read it 3 times, which was 2 more times than was strictly necessary, and then she folded the paper and set it aside and sat for a long time looking at the lamp. She thought, not for the first time, about the particular sensation of being seen, not being noticed, which was easy and which meant nothing. Being seen. Being looked at by someone who had to look carefully to find what was there, because nothing in the room was designed to help him, and who looked anyway. Kessington Hall sent a letter the following week. Not from Pharaoh. In the Duke's own hand, it offered her a position as keeper of the household accounts, which position had been vacated by Holt's dismissal and had been, until recently, supervised by a man of business in the city. The letter noted that the position required accuracy, discretion, and a willingness to report what the accounts actually said, regardless of whether the answer was the comfortable one. The letter noted further that she had demonstrated all 3 qualities under conditions that made the demonstration credible. It was signed with his name and nothing else. She read it in the morning. She wrote her reply in the afternoon, in her father's best pen, which she had kept in the trunk with the books. She arrived at Kessington Hall on the 1st of January. The house in winter was a different thing from the house in October. Quieter, and more itself, the stone. A deeper gray against the bare trees and the light low and clear across the long drive. She came in the servants' entrance because that was still, properly speaking, her entrance, and she set her trunk in the room she had been given, which was not the room she had occupied before, and which had a window that looked east over the kitchen garden and the well. She could see the well from where she stood. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked away, and she put her father's trunk at the foot of the bed and began to unpack. She was at her desk, in the account room on the third morning when he came to the door. He did not knock, and then he did knock, which told her something, and she said, "Come in." And he came in and stood just inside the door with the quality of a man who has made a decision and arrived at the room where the decision lives, but has not yet put it into the room with him. He said, "The January accounts will be the first test. Holt managed the December figures in a way I have not yet been able to interpret." She said, "I have been looking at them." He said, "And?" She said, "There are 3 columns he has marked as estate improvement. 2 of them are. The third is something else. I am not yet certain what." He came to the desk and looked at the ledger page she indicated. He stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the particular gravity of a large person in a small space. And she kept her eyes on the figures because the figures were, at the moment, what was required of her. He said, "You see it?" "Yes," she said. He said quietly, "I thought you would." He did not say anything else for a moment. She turned a page. He said, "Nora." She looked up. It was the first time he had used her name like that, plain and direct, without miss before it, without anything before it, the name alone in his voice. She felt it register somewhere below her ribs, a small struck note that did not resolve. He said, "I have been thinking about what my father's man cost us, what was lost to it, what the families of the common came close to losing." "What you lost," she said. "I am here now." He said, "You are." They looked at each other across the account ledger in the gray January light, and the distance between them was very small, and the distance between them was still, for the moment, exactly what propriety and honesty and the slow, certain weight of 2 people who have seen each other clearly required it to be. "Show me the 3rd column." He said. She showed him. He pulled the chair from beside the bookshelf and sat beside her at the desk, and they worked through the figures together in the cold room, and outside the window the kitchen garden lay quiet and bare, and the well stood, as it always stood, patient and stone, and older than either of them. She had reached into her apron pocket once, without thinking. Before she remembered, she was not in service any longer. Not in the same way, and her apron was not her apron anymore. The pocket was still there. The journal page was still in it. She thought her father would have had something to say about the 3rd column. She thought he would have been right. By spring, the enclosure had been formally withdrawn from the parliamentary record. By spring, Holstead Common was returned to common use, and the families who had nearly lost it had largely forgotten to be grateful, and had moved on to the more immediate business of living, which was, Nora thought, exactly as it should be. She had heard this from Reverend Aldgate, who wrote her a letter that ended with the observation that honesty, like bread, was most useful when no one had to think too hard about where it came from. She kept the letter with her father's journal. The Duke's parliamentary seat was restored in March, the inquiry having confirmed what his own investigation had established. The arrangement had been made without his authorization. His vote had been secured under false premises. His withdrawal of it was consistent with the record of a man trying to govern well in complicated circumstances. His advisers were relieved. The county press was broadly satisfied. Lady Corinna announced her engagement to a baronet in April, and the announcement was received with the quiet, universal approval of a match that suited everyone involved. The house settled into itself as spring came. The kitchen garden unfroze. The well rope was replaced with new rope, oiled and supple. Nora noticed this one morning when she came into the yard for some air and stood looking at it for a moment in the thin April light. She heard his step on the stone path and did not turn. He came and stood beside her. They were at enough distance from the house that no one in particular was watching them, and close enough to each other that the warmth of the morning and the warmth of proximity were briefly indistinguishable. He said, "The accounts are clean now." "Yes," she said. He said, "The 3rd column was a payment to a man named Treswick for surveying work never performed." Holt used the notation to move funds. "I know," she said. I found the survey commission 2 weeks ago, he said. Of course you did. A pause. The kitchen garden very quiet. The rope still. He said, I am going to ask you something, and I would like you to answer honestly. She said, I do not have another way to answer. She heard something in his breath that was almost, not quite, a sound of amusement. He said, Are you content here? She considered this as she would have considered the ledger question, with genuine attention, without rushing to the comfortable answer. She was warm. She was useful. She was doing work that stretched her mind and required what she actually had to give. She was, every third morning or so, in a room with a person who looked at her as though what she said mattered, and then demonstrated consistently that this was not performance. The accounts were honest, the house was well run. She had found gradually, and without intending to, that she was less invisible than she had been at the well, and that being seen was not, as she had half expected, uncomfortable. She had expected being seen to feel like exposure. It felt more like warmth. She said yes. He said, I would like you to continue to be. She turned to look at him then. He was looking at well, not at her, with the expression of a man who has said a thing that means more than the words and is giving her space to hear it properly. There was something particular in his profile in the spring light, the jaw no longer quite as set as it had been in October, the tiredness not gone but altered, as though it had been rested against something reliable and found less heavy than before. She was aware of her own heartbeat. She said, I intend to. He looked at her then. The gray eyes that were the color of late autumn sky, and in them something that had been working for a long time toward the surface. Patient, exact, arrived. He said, Good. He did not touch her. He did not need to. Not yet. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder, close enough that the next step, when it came, would not require much distance at all. They stood in the spring morning, in the kitchen garden with the clean rope hanging still and the light coming low and gold over the stone wall, and what was between them was as real and specific and quietly certain as any entry in any ledger Nora had ever opened, a figure she had checked twice and would not need to check again. In her apron pocket, the journal page rested where it always rested, her father's hand pressed into the paper, and she could feel the shape of it without reaching for it. The man who sees and does not speak has chosen the lesser comfort. She had chosen otherwise. She was still choosing. Thank you for staying until the end. If Nora's courage stayed with you, leave a word below. Want?